Hello, Mandy.
Hello.
Kay's here. There's Kayla. Kayla, Mandy. So, what's new?
Nothing much.
Nothing much? Well, sometimes that's good. Teresa. Hello, Teresa, how are you? Well, just kind of sit here and wait for an extra couple minutes. Oh, here comes Aisha's in. Hello, Aisha.
Hello.
How are you?
Good and yourself?
Pretty good. You're not in the office today? You look like you must be at home.
We on spring break.
Oh, forgot about that. That's all the CPS, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Hello, Rachel.
Hi, Professor. How are you?
I'm okay.
Good.
Here comes Emma. Well, I guess we might just as well get started. Got almost everybody. So I am going to ask first off if anybody has any questions that you want to ask before we get started today.
I have one.
Okay.
I remember you said that one way describe three items and the two items, right? How to list the three items?
So I'm not quite sure I understand your question.
If we say I have two things, one is apple, another one is orange.
Okay.
So you say three things. How to list the three things in one
How do you
sentence?
say three things?
Uh-huh.
Well, you might say something like I have apples, comma, oranges, comma, that second comma is kind of optional, comma, and then and bananas.
Yeah, but this is doesn't say one, the other, another. I mean the compound sentence. Yeah.
A compound sentence?
Yes.
It would probably be something like I have apples, and I have oranges, and I have, let's see, you could do it with ands in each case, and I have bananas. Or you could go, I have apples, comma, I have oranges, comma, and I have bananas.
No,
Is that what you're talking about? Are we?
It's not as simple as this. I'm going to say three triangles. So the sentence. I remember it's the one is and the other or other. How to say it?
Oh, another and other?
Yeah, how to use it.
Well, you would use an other if you were talking about a single thing that is different. Other, let's see, I have other things. Other you would probably use with something plural. But an other is something that really references just one thing. So I have another apple, but I also have other fruit or other fruits. Am I getting where you're going yet?
No. I might just send you an email.
Okay. That'd probably work better
Okay.
because I'm not sure I understand your question.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was one question. Any others? Anybody else have other questions they want to bring up before we get started? All right, then let us get into the topics that we need to talk about today. We're really talking about, over the last couple of days, we've talked a couple of final verb forms, things that we've had to talk about. One of those was phrasal verbs. And even more recently than that, we had the passive voice. And so we want to talk about those two today. And then, assuming I've got a little bit of time left, I want to introduce you into what we're going to be talking about next, because we're going to start looking not so much at individual parts of speech, but we're going to start looking at how sentences are built. And that may sound strange because oftentimes people think, well, we string a bunch of words together and we have a sentence. But in fact, when you look at the way a sentence is structured, it's really quite different from just a string of words. So we're going to get started with that today and with Wednesday's reading. But before we do that, I want to talk about the passive voice and just a quick review on phrasal verbs. And a couple of things to remember. If you look at the syllabus, you'll see that for weeks 14 and 15, we're going to be meeting both Mondays and Wednesdays, kind of like we did at the very beginning. We met 2 days a week at the beginning, then we changed it down to just one. As we get into 14 and 15, however, we're going to go back to 2 days a week, partly because you're going to be doing some work together, and partly just want to make sure that we get everything covered before we hit the final portfolio. And the next thing to talk about is that we've also got portfolio part two. Part two is due next Monday before we have class. So before class on 4/5, should be up on D2L. Remember, I want to get these in a PDF form, and I want, if possible, that you take at least the 5 lesson plans and get them into one PDF document. If you have to have another file or a couple of other files for some of the supporting materials like quizzes or exercises or activities, that's okay. But I would really appreciate it if you'll get all 5 of the lesson plans into a single PDF. But that's going to be due next Monday. And then we've got the final part of the portfolio. And in this one's going to be a pair exercise. Maybe there'll be one group of 3. But what we're going to be doing there is we're going to have you develop one lesson, not 5, but you're going to come up with one very detailed lesson. And that should be delivered with all of the pictures or of your realia or manipulables that you may want to use, any charts that you use, games, assessments, all of that stuff really needs to be fully developed and turned in. Now, this is going to include, as you get ready to package it up, it will include a lesson plan, basically the same thing that you've been doing on part 1 and part 2, where you normally do 5. Well, we'll still want one of those documents. And the second thing is I want you to put together a PowerPoint that shows the new information that you're going to be presenting. And it also shows how you're going to do this lesson. This is where you're going to be doing a presentation on Zoom with your partner. And I want to see how you're going to go about approaching the class. You should expect this to be a class that would usually be 30 to 45 minutes long, but we don't have time for everybody to do a full lesson. So what you're going to be doing is presenting the lesson content and how you would go about doing that lesson. But you won't be sitting down and doing a 50-minute or a 45-minute lesson. It'll be 15 minutes approximately for each pair. Okay? So that's what Portfolio 3 is coming along. You're going to have 2 full class days where I'll expect you to be here so that you can actually get into a breakout room and work with your partner on pulling this together. If you have somebody that you particularly want to work with, then I'll let you pick a partner. And what I want you to do is you need to do that by the 12th of April. That's 2 weeks from today. And you both have to email me saying, yes, we want to work as a partner. If you want to do that, that's great. I'll honor that. If on the other hand, you really don't know anybody or you don't particularly care who you work with, I will randomly assign everybody else into pairs or a possible group of 3. Okay, so part 2 is next week, and it's going to be 5 lessons on verbs. Anything that you want to talk about with verbs, passive tense, phrasal verbs, different tenses and aspects of verbs, subject-verb agreement, any of those things are perfectly good for part 2. And part 3, as you get into it, is going to be looking at more complicated sentence structures and some things like different clause types, etc. We'll talk about that some more as we go. But that's the stuff that's coming up. Any questions on that?
Yes, I have one.
Okay.
When I look at the book,
Yes.
I saw some verb lesson plan with nouns or pronouns or adjectives. Is that okay?
Well, you wouldn't want to be talking about adjectives and pronouns on this one. That was for the first one. On the other hand, if you're talking about subject-verb agreement with different kinds of pronouns, that would be fine.
I mean, mix. It include the verb and others too.
Well, you might include other parts of speech too, but the main focus of all 5 of these should be verbs.
Okay.
Okay?
Okay, thank you.
Any others? Okay. So let's get on here and talk about the difference between active voice and passive voice. I believe that was your reading for, I can't remember if it was the one for Wednesday or for today. But most of the time, we usually talk in active voice. And you may be thinking back to grades or comments that you've gotten on written essays in the past where your teacher says, don't use passive voice. In some cases, they go to the extreme and say, oh, you should never use passive voice, but that's not really true. It's perfectly good, but you probably want to do it a little bit limited. But normally we speak in active voice. And when we do that, what we're typically talking about is a subject that is performing an action. All right? The subject is performing the action. So in this particular case, the subject is the doer, or if you want to talk in slightly fancier terms, we could call it the subject is the agent. The doer or the agent does something to something else. Okay? That's what active voice is all about. And so when I say John kicked the dog and the car broke down, or if I were to say Sally likes Jerry, in all of those cases, we're talking about somebody doing something. So we're talking about the active voice. when we've used the active voice, you're going to find out that the active voice can work with all kinds of different verbs. But with the passive voice, you're going to have either a direct object, or you're going to have a direct object and an indirect object. And I think in a minute you'll see why that happens. Active voice, linking verbs, transitive verbs, ditransitive verbs, etc. It's all fine. By the time we get down to transitive verbs, however, we're looking at using it with indirect objects or direct objects. They have to be there. So that means that the sky is blue has no passive form. Okay? Because is never going to be, or to be, maybe I should say to be, is never going to be a transitive verb by itself. Okay? So transitive verbs are the things that we can use in passive sentences. So here's one. John gave the students a test. Well, John is the subject. I'm the agent. I actually did the action of giving. And then I've got the students as an indirect object and a test as the direct object. This is the active voice. John did, or John gave the students a test. Another case of an active voice sentence is the students received the test with great joy, by the way. And the students actually are doing the receiving. Okay, so again, we are looking at the students receive, and they receive something. In both of these cases, we've got direct objects to work with, but we've got John actively giving the verb, or actively gave, and that's the verb. And the students actively receive. In both cases, they're the people who are doing the action. Now, the place where things get different is when we start to talk about the passive voice. And the passive voice is going to turn everything around. It's no longer who did the action that's the most important. It tends to become the person or thing that received the action has now become the most important piece of information. For instance, the passive voice turns the players around because the receiver of the action, not the agent, not the doer, but the receiver becomes the most important piece of information, and it moves to the subject position of the sentence. Now, if I say the receiver of the action, what sentence function would that be? What would we call that? What would be the function of in the sentence that would be the receiver of the action?
Is it the indirect object?
It would be the direct object, and so the direct object suddenly moves to the front and becomes the subject of the sentence. All right, keep that in mind. The object will move to the subject position. And then we've got to make some changes to the verb. So if we were to look at that, we could sit there and go, the dog was kicked. Remember, the first thing I said was, John kicked the dog. Well, that's the active sentence. The dog was kicked. Or also we could say the dog got kicked. But who was the receiver of the kick? Kayla? Who received the kick?
The dog.
The dog. And so in this particular case, what is the subject of the sentence?
Go on.
Well, the receiver of the action has now been moved to the subject. From the active sentence, he kicked the dog was kicked, or the dog got kicked. Either one. Suddenly, we also have the ball was thrown. Rachel?
Yes.
What received the action of throwing? If
The
somebody
ball.
throws a ball, who's receiving the action?
The ball.
The ball, exactly. So now instead of saying she threw the ball, with she being the agent, now we've got the ball being moved to the subject position because it's, for whatever reason, is more important than she. Notice also, as we move that forward, we're changing the verb form around a little bit. Here it's just simple past tense, right? He kicked the dog. But when we're up in this case, we're going to change the verb around to be and the past participle. Here it's a little clearer down here because we didn't say she threw the ball. That's the past tense of throw. But the ball was, there's the to be part, and thrown, which is the past participle. He stole the bike was stolen. In any of those cases, what we're doing is the main verb becomes to be or get. And the receiver of the action is moved to the front, and the main verb is changed to a past participle. Just 1, 2, 3. The thing is just the same way over and over again. So, having said it there, how do we do it? In 3 steps, I think. The direct object or the indirect object. And keep that one in mind. That one's one that's often forgotten. The direct object or the indirect object in the active sentence becomes the subject of the passive sentence. Okay? So it literally moves from somewhere behind the verb over to in front of the verb so that it can be the subject of the sentence. Be or get is then used as the main verb, okay? And it's going to be in the same tense and aspect that the active sentence was, main verb was. That's going to be important. Be or get in the same tense and aspect as the active sentence main verb becomes the auxiliary verb, and the main verb changes to the past participle. The main verb changes to the past participle. So we got 3 basic steps. You're going to find either the direct object or the indirect object and move it to the subject position. You're going to take the verb that was there and put it in its past participle form and insert either be or get with the same tense that the main verb used to be in. And I'm going to show you that on the next slide in case that seems strange. But you want to keep the verb tense the same as you move from active to passive. The difference is we're going to be using be or get as the auxiliary verb and then the past participle. So let us stop right there. Let me ask you if you got questions, or if you want to take a couple seconds to think that through. But it's 3 basic steps. Object to subject position, main verb to past participle, and insert be or get in the same tense. We're using the original active sentence.
So, Mr. Jiang,
Yeah.
are you going to explain the difference between the be and the get?
Sure. Normally, that's a very good question. We usually, if you get into a grammar book, the grammar book is going to say we take be, we put it in the same tense as the active sentence and put it in front of the past participle. That is definitely true. But we also oftentimes use get or got, and the difference there is oftentimes get is much more informal than the be. The car was crashed, or let's say the tree was hit, or the tree got hit, or the ball was kicked, ball got kicked. One of the differences is the get seems to be much more informal. The other side of this often happens when it seems like something suddenly happens. If I was talking about something, I was in a car accident, I got hit. I might be talking about I got hit, just like this is more sudden. If I'm talking about it long in the past, it would probably be just was. But it's mostly informality, and if something happens suddenly, we oftentimes use get.
One time my car was towed, and then I went to there. I say, my car got a towed, and feels like they don't understand what I say.
And when did you say your car got towed and they didn't understand it? That's surprising because we use it a lot. Aisha, you use things like got frequently. He got hit.
Yes.
As it or the cake got eaten. Well, we probably wouldn't say the cake got eaten. We'd probably say there the cake was eaten. But I think we could take a car got towed and it got towed or it was towed. Either one would be pretty much equal. So I think I'm surprised that they didn't grasp it unless maybe they didn't quite hear the word got properly. But we use it all the time. And the thing that's funny is they don't put it in very many textbooks. Other questions? Okay, so what I would suggest you do is make sure you've really got these 3 steps down, because you follow the 3 steps, it's going to work. I can tell you that on the final exam, I'm going to give you some active sentences and tell you to change it to passive. And I'm going to give you some passive sentences and ask you to change them to active. The way it's done, and again, either the direct object or the indirect object may become the subject. The main verb gets changed to the past participle, and be or get is used in the same tense as the original sentence's main verb. It's really that simple. And one thing to remember is you're not going to be able to take an intensive verb, for instance, and make it passive. It's always going to be some kind of a transitive verb. That's all there is to that one. Now, what I wanted to show you, this is a page out of the workbook. And what I was trying to do here, instead of letting people go off and go, oh yes, and forget the fact that the tenses need to stay the same, pay some attention to this. When I was looking at the active sentence and the verb was wrote, that was the past tense. When I moved that to the passive, my to be verb became the past tense, were, and the main verb, which was wrote, becomes the past participle. Children have read. There's an interesting one. This is the present perfect. Have read. When I go over to the passive, my be verb has changed also to the present perfect. Or will affect in the third becomes will be. So we're always copying and we're carrying that verb tense from the active over to the passive.
Do you mind if I butt in just for a sec?
I'm sorry?
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
So it says children have read this book for almost a century, and then when you turn it to the passive voice, the children are no longer mentioned. Is it just optional to put that in, that subject from the first active?
Thank you for asking that question. Yes, it is really optional whether you put in that original subject again.
Mm-hmm.
Here's an example. I might have even said it in the video. George Bush once said that mistakes were made. He didn't say I made mistakes. He didn't say might have my Secretary of Defense made mistakes. He just said mistakes were made and didn't blame anyone. One of the reasons that we use the passive is to avoid blame, or maybe we don't know who did it. The dog was kicked. Maybe you don't know that it was me that kicked the dog. All you know is the dog was kicked. So that original subject can be put at the end of the sentence after the word by, but it's definitely not required. So that's a great question. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
So if you look at the second set, you'll notice that they did use the by the original sentence. Bill drives the car is driven by Bill. Not only are we matching the to be verb with the main verb from the active sentence, in this case, they decided to say by Bill, but it's by no means required. Are we good?
Yeah.
So this is, I think this is out on D2L. I'm gonna make sure I put it out there because I want you to make sure that you recognize how are we changing these things back and forth, because people sometimes mess that up. All right, and here's the one place I wanted to finish off by reminding you that when we have an active sentence and we move to the passive sentence, both, maybe I should say either the direct object or the indirect object can become the subject of the passive sentence. So in the sentence, Bill gave Sue the ball. Sue is the indirect object and the ball is the direct object, correct? Down here, when we look at the passive, look, we can take the indirect object and make it the subject. Sue was given the ball. Or we could take the direct object, the ball, and say the ball was given to Sue. It's important to recognize that we can typically do this and use either the direct object or the indirect object. But if a sentence does not have one, you cannot make that sentence passive. Okay, how exciting. I would ask you to turn over, let's see, I think it is, in the workbook in key 14. Again, unlike we used to do at the very beginning, now I'm going to kind of speed through this a little bit more quickly than stopping and asking you on every page if you understand it. But I'm looking for anybody who has questions about any of the answers in key 14. Are we good?
I know I had one. I left the book in the other room.
Okay, I'm waiting.
All right. Don't hold your breath. Okay, it's actually right here. So this 3.14.4.
Yes.
I forget which one it was that I had the same. Had been driving. I remember the answer was different from the key. Can we just go through? Let me see which one I messed up.
3.14.4.
Right, Bill drives the car. So yeah, number 3, when it says the car has been driven by Bill.
Okay.
What did I say?
The car has been driven. Right. Okay, so what did we do? Well, we still have to be in the present perfect. So has driven is the present perfect, right?
I guess so.
Okay. I'll sell it to you for $20.
Yeah.
Yes, it is. So has has driven is the present perfect. It's got have in the present tense and driven in the past participle. So when we go back over here, has driven, we still keep the has, we still keep the driven, but we have to insert be in the same form that it was. So driven and been are both past participles.
Okay.
And so we go from has driven to has been driven. Has stays the same. In this case, driven is already in its past participle form, but we insert be in as the same tense as driven.
Same. All right, I will go through them again with that renewed knowledge.
Okay,
Cool.
it's a little tricky. I won't put one like that on the test.
Okay, thanks.
I'll put something else on there, but basically speaking, driven was there in the past participle. Be
Get out
must
my
be there in
room.
that same form, and driven still
Go.
needs to be there as the past participle. Okay? Now, why is it that your teachers would have told you don't use the passive voice?
Get out.
Oftentimes, people look at the passive voice
Get
as
out.
being something not only to avoid blame,
Get
but it's something
out.
that is fairly weak. It
Get
doesn't
out.
tell us
Get
who
out.
did
Get
it.
out.
And so if you were
I'm in
to
class.
say, let's say the schoolgirls were kidnapped, right? Think about Nigeria, right? I can't remember, the Boko Haram or something like that. The girls were kidnapped or the girls were abused. By using that form, we are leaving Boko Haram out. They're not having to take any accountability, right? And so, as you say, the children were abused. Well, who was the abuser? Because that ought to be important. We don't want to blow past who the culprit is when something wrong goes or something wrong happens. So that's why they typically will say, oh, you don't want to use the passive, it's too weak. However, you may have also run into biology teachers or chemistry teachers or physics teachers who said, when you write up a science experiment, you should be using the passive voice, like the water was boiled, etc., because they're not interested in who did it. They're interested in what were the steps taken. And hopefully in an experiment, everybody comes to the same result. So who did it is unimportant. But that's a place where typically people say you should use the passive, but it's a valid statement, it's a valid verb form. Just don't overuse it and don't allow it to be used to avoid accountability. Okay? All right, let us see. Anything else in passive voice? Very cool. Off we go. So, phrasal verbs, I told you these are my favorite, but they are particularly difficult for English language learners, partly because we have to use the exact words in the correct order, otherwise it won't make sense to English speakers. Plus, we're very likely to say something that we didn't mean if we don't do it exactly. And the other reason is, since it takes multiple words in an exact sequence, many phrasal verbs, if not most, have a single word replacement or substitute. And for our English language learners, it's probably easier for them to learn the single word tolerate than it is for them to remember to use put up with in that exact sequence. So they are difficult, but if you ever sit around listening to people talk, you will find that we use words like came down with or put up with much more often than we say contracted, caught, or what was the last one I used? Or tolerate. But But given that we use these so frequently, it's very important for our students to begin to learn them, because they're going to hear them more often than they will the other. So they're made up of 2 or 3 parts. We are either going to have a verb and a preposition, like turn in, or we're going to have a verb and an adverb, perhaps like run up. Or in some cases, we will have all 3, the verb, an adverb, and a preposition. But the most important thing is that the pieces of this add up to a meaning that's different than if you try to put the 2 or 3 words together. For instance, if you use turn in, and you use it because you're going to turn in a homework assignment, there is no turning being done. You're not turning it back and forth. Where's there? You're not turning it back and forth. It's just being turned. Now, in makes some sense, but you turn in, there's no turning involved.
I'm not done.
Similarly, if you use turn in to say, I'm going to sleep
You
now,
monster.
I'm going to turn in.
I'm not done.
That's another way to say I'm going to bed, but there's no turning
I'm not
there.
done.
And so if I say turn, that would mean I'm going to do something like this, and
I'm
in,
gonna cut you in half and return you to Wi-Fi.
wherever I'm going to turn in, oftentimes it just doesn't add up. Same thing with
You
run
there?
up. I can run up a hill. very
No.
easily, or anybody can run
Get
up a
out of
hill.
here.
Joe ran up the hill. But Joe ran up the bill. Well, he didn't really run up. There was no running involved.
I'm not done.
The only thing that went up was the amount on the bill. So we can take these, sometimes they
When does
add
it
up
show
to
10?
mean exactly what we expect. When they don't, we can consider them phrasal verbs.
Hey,
It's
my
very
clock's
important to
singing.
pay attention to the context, if it's phrasal or non-phrasal. If I put on the test, why is the squirrel ran up the tree not phrasal, and Bill ran up or Joe ran up the bill is phrasal? You have to look at the context to see, right? And so this is particularly important as we start to teach our students. Now, here's the problem, though. There is no really good set of rules to use for figuring out when the phrasal verb is built or used, right? They don't make sense by putting the words together. They don't make sense by definition. And therefore, unfortunately, many of our students are just going to have to learn through exposure and or memorization. And you can go out onto the internet, Google phrasal verbs, and it will take you to sites where you can find hundreds of them. They're very common. They're very easy to misunderstand from an English language learner's point of view. And they are something that we do all the time in our regular speech. So much like we want our students to be able to speak English, we want our students to be able to understand that English that they encounter as well. One's not going to be very much good without the other. So phrasal verbs are going to be idiomatic, meaning they mean something different than the sum of the words. And in a non-phrasal context, like the squirrel ran up the tree, you're taking it literally. So idiomatic, phrasal, literal, non-phrasal. All right. That brings us over. We're going to talk about 2 sets of exercises here. I'm going into the workbook on pages, for key 11, which is on page 171. And I will ask if you have any questions here. righty, I'm gonna assume that we don't have any questions there. I'm gonna also go over to the multi-part verb sheet. That was the worksheet that I handed out last time. We talked over, I think we talked about 11 and 12. Basically, we're trying to look at these and decide, is the verb followed by the preposition or adverb a phrasal verb, or is it regular? And so I'm just going to start up at the top because I can. And I'll go, John.
Professor, I actually have a question about the exercise book, page 174.
174. Yeah, okay, all right.
Yeah.
And what question?
All of them.
All of them?
Yeah.
Okay. Is that in both 15 and 16 or just 16?
On page 164
164 or 174?
or 174, 3.11.16.
Okay, so let's take a look. The little girl yelled, "Let me exit this taxi now." Well, that means it's perfectly good meaning. Nobody would misunderstand what you said, but you would begin to sound kind of like an English textbook, because probably a native speaker would never say, "Let me exit this car or this taxi now." We'd say, "Let me out," or "Let me get out."
Oh,
Okay?
oh.
And so if you were to say, "Let me exit this taxi now," everybody would understand, but it would sound rather strange. If I look at B, don't forget to use the whole phrasal verb. On weekends, I do not need to wake up early,
Oh,
so I never set my alarm. You know what? You could actually, in perfectly good, it would be perfectly good English to say, I do not need to wake early. But we very seldom would say it that way. Even though it'd be easier for us to say it, we'd probably still say, I don't need to wake up. Letter C, after a long night of reading and studying for my final exam, I was so tired that I passed away on the couch. Now, what does passed away mean?
this died.
I'm sorry?
Somebody died.
Somebody died, exactly. So if you were to sit there and say, I passed away on the couch, well, that's just the wrong word. And unfortunately, since we have to use exactly the right combination of words in exactly the right order, you would be misunderstood. Now, I had a friend that used to work for me and he had cancer. It was back when my kids were little, and he called me on the phone, but I wasn't at home. And so it was in the evening, he was in the hospital, and he said, please ask your dad to call me because they're going to put me to sleep pretty soon. Now, the only case my son could ever think of is in terms of being put to sleep is when you euthanize an animal. And so he calls me screaming and crying because this guy's going to be put to sleep and he wants to talk to me first. So they do, even English speakers will screw it up and say it the wrong way because he was a native English speaker, but just the fact that he said put to sleep was wrongly interpreted by my son. Any more of these specifically that you're interested in, or should I just run through them all?
Can you just correct it? I don't know how to say it.
I'm sorry?
What's wrong?
Okay, so can you help me ascertain, this is letter D. Can you help me ascertain the phone number for the post office? Here again, it's probably easier to say ascertain because it's just one word, but we would never ask it that way. I don't think we would ever say that. We'd probably say, can you help me figure out
Oh,
the phone or find out the phone number? Ascertain? Man, I bet you nobody on this call has ever used ascertain in casual conversation. I could be wrong. But are you taking all the information you need for that test? 3, don't forget to use the whole phrase. What would we use here? Are you taking all the information you need for that test? I'm trying to think what we might say differently. Anybody? Taking. The answer I have is don't forget to use the whole phrasal verb, but I can't think of what the second part would be. Anybody? Kayla, save me. Kayla, save me. Taking. Maybe it's taking in all the information. That's probably what it could be.
oh, yeah, 16. Okay.
Or taking in.
Uh-huh.
Will the boss pick down our reports tomorrow? Well, I think what we're really looking for is pick up our reports tomorrow. My uncle was coming into town. My mother went to pick up him at the airport. You remember what's wrong with that? Pick up him at the airport? What's wrong with that, Aisha?
Say it again.
Yeah, it's letter G. My uncle was coming into town. My mother went to pick up him at the airport. Why does that second sentence sound goofy?
Because my mother went to pick him up.
Pick him up. Exactly. Now, the trick here is that if we have a phrasal verb like pick up, and it can be broken and the object put in the middle, if you use a pronoun, it has to go in the middle. I'm sure that's written up in the book. I know it's also in my videos on separable phrasal verbs. If you use a phrasal verb that can be separated and the object is a pronoun, it has to go in the middle. Otherwise, it sounds stupid, goofy. But if she said, my mother went to pick up my uncle, it would sound perfectly fine. But if she has to use him, it doesn't sound right. The business proposal is interesting and I need one night to think it. Think it over would be a good one. Think about it would be good. Either one of those two, but you wouldn't typically just think it. Teenagers are used to loud music, so my teenager always asks, Mom, can you please increase the volume of the TV? Aiden, what would we normally say?
Turn it up.
Turn it up or turn up the volume. We don't say increase the volume. The vice president's flight was delayed, so our meeting could not take place. We had to call off it. Going back to Aisha's example, it needs to be in the middle between call off. Call off it doesn't sound good. Call it off is required, but we could say call off the meeting, and then it would have been fine. If he had stopped at a gas station, he would not have run away of gas. Teresa, what's wrong? Kayla, let's jump to you. What's wrong with that?
It should be he would never ran out of gas.
He would not have never ran, but okay, but run out of gas, not run away, right? That's two different things. And then in letter L, Juan is an excellent student. Last week, he was one of the few students who turned in his essay on time. This week, he turned in it 3 days early. It needs to be in between the verb and that part. Okay? So I'm going back over here. It's my turn. Number 1 on the worksheet. The hours flew by. Well, I think that is a phrasal verb or a multi-part verb because hours don't fly. I have, in my 66 years, I have never stood outside and seen an hour fly by. So it must be phrasal or multi-part. I think the plant was cared for is probably, cared for is perfectly good, and it would be a verb with a preposition. I'm now tired of answering questions. Number 3, Rachel. She eagerly passed on the rumor.
This is phrasal verb.
Yes, very good. Aiden, you got the easy one. The frog turned into a prince.
I don't have this. The prince turned into a frog.
The frog turned into a prince.
I'm not getting the error there.
No, it's not an error. Is it a multi-part phrasal verb or is it a regular verb and preposition?
Sorry.
It's what?
It's regular.
Phrasal.
It's phrasal.
Regular. Yeah.
I mean, okay, right? You didn't really.
I guess it could be regular. If the frog is hopping down the street and turns around and runs into the prince,
Bam.
that would be okay. We could call it
Phrasal.
regular. But in this
Okay,
case,
that
I
would
don't
be
think so. But now to save yourself.
Okay.
Number 5, the taxi turned into a side street.
Okay, that is regular.
That is regular. Exactly. So in the first one, the frog became a prince as a single word substitute for turned into. And that's the way an English language learner might prefer to say it. But the taxi became a side street. Well, that's not going to be it.
Right.
No substitute available.
Right.
Teresa, I saved the hard one for you. We will allow for slight, we will allow for slight delay.
I said verb with phrase.
So you said a verb with, okay, so I didn't. Normally, what is allow? Give permission to do that? Are they
No.
giving permission for slight delays? Or is it meaning something slightly different?
When I'm done, I'll be out. Get out.
Now, I would say that you could argue this one either way, and I've gone back and forth over time. So you said it was allow for
Go
slight
up
delays.
that
The
page.
only problem I have with that is allow it, we're gonna give permission for slight delays. Maybe not so good.
Yeah.
You wanna redeem yourself? Okay, how about 8? We talked over the proposal.
Phrasal verb.
Great. Versus 9, we talked over the fence.
Verb with phrase.
What's the difference there?
Um,
Why is one and the other?
9 is literally.
Yes.
Literally. Yeah.
We probably did not put the proposal in between us and talk over it, but we did talk over the fence, right? That's a good one. All right, who's next on the list? I bet it's gonna be Mandy. You haven't said a word the whole time. Mandy, we're gonna, let's talk about 10.
Phrasal verb for number 10.
Yes, exactly. How do you do away? I don't know. The way, do and away doesn't, I'm gonna do away. Well, that doesn't make any sense. But do away with that eyesore, it's idiomatic. We're gonna get rid of it. There's another way to have said it. Thank you very kindly. I'm gonna let you do number 13 too. For 13 also. Marjorie fell out with her colleague.
Phrasal verb.
Phrasal. We saw something like that the other day when we saw number 11. and the partners fell out. Well, what do you mean they fell out? Fell out with her colleagues. She didn't do any real falling. Now we're the king. Robinson lives on a small salary. Phrasal or literal?
Phrasal,
Why?
unless they're a very small person.
Very good. All right, so it's pretty hard to stand on your salary, right? But how about 15? Robinson lives on a small island. Okay, again.
That's what they're doing.
Yep, sure is, because literally he could live on a small island. All right, so Michaela, I haven't heard from you this wonderful day either. So this is Mandy K. Michaela. Oh, Emma's down there too. Okay, Michaela, I need you to tell me about number 16. The customer ran up an enormous debt.
I wrote down that ran up is a phrasal multi-part word.
You got it. And then we've already talked about 17. You want to be a hero? Give me 17. The squirrel ran up a tree.
Ran up, and it is a verb with a prepositional phrase.
Actually, I think it's more of an adverb, but you're absolutely right. It is not a phrasal verb. Emma. Number 18. She's always running down her friends. She's always running down her friends.
It was.
Are you talking phrasal? Your microphone not working well. So
I
I think
wrote it was phrasal.
phrasal.
I wrote down it was phrasal verb.
Yep. How about 19?
I said phrasal for it.
On the phrasal verb?
Yeah, I said phrasal.
Yeah, I agree. Because you didn't run down the fleeing suspect, even if you ran over him with the car, right? And then finally, who's running down the street? That one strikes me as quite literal. Okay, so get a handle on those. I'll probably give you a couple of those on the test, trying to tell me why one is phrasal and one is not. So you'll want to have that in mind. Now, what I would like to do, I'm going to stop sharing this one, and I'm just going to give you a couple minute introduction. What we're going to be talking about for the next couple of weeks today is sentence structure. And you'll see, if you haven't watched, you may have already watched it for all I know. We're getting ready to talk about something called constituents, or a phrase. And so I was covering this in my graduate class the other day, and we've probably all agreed to believe that a phrase has several words together. But when we're looking at linguistics,
Go away, I'm in class. Go on.
Shut the fuck up.
replaced by another single word, then very typically we're going to have a one-word phrase. And phrases, which we're going to talk about first, clauses, which we still have yet to talk about, but will, can be referred to as constituents or constituent parts. So what are the differences? Well, first off, a phrase is going to be a group of words, but that phrase will not have both a subject and a verb. In fact, it might not have either one. At the store, for instance, has no verb and it has no subject. But it is a perfectly good prepositional phrase. I could say, went to the store. Well, that's a good verb phrase because it's got a verb, but it doesn't tell us who. And so it's going to be a phrase also. It doesn't have enough to be a sentence or a clause. So a phrase will be a group of words, and that could be a group of one or more words that misses either the subject or the verb or both. Clauses, on the other hand, tend to have both a subject and a verb. Sometimes that subject and a verb or that clause can stand alone as a sentence. In fact, a simple sentence is the same thing as an independent clause. It can stand alone because it's got a subject and a verb, and it is a complete thought. But if I walk into the room and say, and there's no other context, and I say, since I moved to Illinois, that's all I say. I'm not answering a question. I just walk into the room and say, since I moved to Illinois, I would expect you to say, since you moved to Illinois, what? Because it's an incomplete thought. Since I moved to Illinois, I would expect you to say, be recognizing something's missing. That would be a dependent clause. An independent clause, though, could even be shorter and say, I moved to Illinois. Well, in that case, it means something different, but I moved to Illinois is a perfectly good sentence. That would be an independent clause. And so sentences are going to be made up of at least an independent clause, but in many cases, they'll have multiple clauses. We will talk about this more later. But the thing I want you to recognize is this idea of a phrase. And I want you to remember that in linguistics, a phrase can be a group of one or more words. Just kind of put that in your brain somewhere because it's not intuitively obvious. We've always been taught phrases had many words. We will be doing something different there. All right. Now, we are going to be looking at different kinds of verbs, and these verbs are going to be classified based on the type, the word type, or the part of speech of the main word, or what we would normally call the head word, or the phrase's head. It's the most important word, and it's going to define what type of a phrase we have. For instance, a noun phrase is going to have a noun in it, and it's going to have all of the other words going along with it to describe it, to say which one we're talking about, and so forth. So if I were to look at noun phrase here, I could say dogs. Dogs. No other word, just dogs could be a noun phrase. If I said it in a sentence, I could say dogs, the noun phrase, are wonderful animals. Well, dogs is still a noun phrase all by itself. I could change that and talk about the black dog. Now I've got two things in addition to dog that is telling me which dog am I talking about. I'm talking about the black dog. And so now suddenly I've got multiple words. I've got article, I've got an adjective, and then I've got the word, the noun dog, but it's all a noun phrase. And similarly, if I look at the big glass building in Chicago, the most important word in there is building. Why do I say it's the most important word? Well, the is describing building, big is describing building, glass is describing building, and so is in Chicago. I'm not talking about the big glass building in Cleveland. I'm talking about the big glass building in Chicago. So building is the most important word there. Building is a noun, and it's got lots of complements there, including in Chicago. Interestingly, Chicago would be another noun phrase, but we'll talk about that later. A verb phrase is going to be the verb in all its complements. Sometimes, just like a single word noun phrase, we could have a single word verb phrase. What did you do yesterday? I swam. Swam is a perfectly good verb phrase. It's a perfectly good predicate. I swam is a perfectly good sentence. So swam by itself may be a verb phrase. Devoured the steak. Well, if I use the word devour, I almost have to say what I devoured. We would never say, oh, I devoured, or I devoured. It's I devoured something. Devoured the steak would be a verb phrase. And quickly ran home. Well, quickly describes ran, and home describes ran. So quickly ran home is a verb phrase. Even though it doesn't start with a verb, but it is a modifier for that verb. Prepositional phrases are going to start with a preposition, and almost always they're going to end with a noun phrase. Of little consequence. Well, of is the preposition. Consequence is a noun. Little consequence, I'm going to call a determiner for now, based on the way it's being used. But anyway, we've got of and a noun phrase, little consequence. Or we've got on and the noun phrase, the sidewalk. Or in and the noun phrase, town. Adjective phrases are usually pretty simple. They're either going to be an adjective or they're going to be an adjective with some kind of an intensifier on the front. Like very. Very small is a little different than small. Fast is one thing, but extremely fast is intensified. Or elegant and particularly elegant. These three things here are adjective phrases, and an adverb phrase is going to be an adverb in all its modifiers. So quickly by itself would be an adverb. So would exceedingly or elegantly. But look here, loyally is an adverb that's got another adverb on the front. So sometimes we use intensifiers that are adverbs with other adverbs. The point that I'm trying to get is I want you to start looking at these things as phrases, because what we're going to realize is as we get into the next few lessons, we are going to realize that sentences are being made out of constituents, not really just not just a list of words. They're being made up of constituents, specific kinds of constituents. And we're going to find that we can use the word phrase and clause in synonymously with constituent, because we could look at something and say, wow, look at this. A sentence has to be made up of at least a constituent noun phrase, constituent, or a constituent verb phrase. It's made up of a noun phrase or a verb phrase or a constituent and a couple of pairs of constituents. So that's where we're going to stop today. It's just kind of an idea to get you started just a little as you get ready to move into looking at sentences and the way they're built. And that'll be definitely a big chunk of the last test. You've done it a little bit already when we started looking at functions within a sentence. But now we're going to look at it in a little more detail, a little more generally, so we can see how how sentences are actually built. Okay? My jaw is tired. I don't want to talk anymore. However, if you have questions, you can stay here and ask me questions, and I will punish myself by answering your question with my jaw. And if you don't have any questions, well, I'll see you next Monday. Anybody with questions, please hang on.